Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the third and final in our series of Nobel in Focus 2020, where we look at the scientific discovery which was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry this year, which is for the development of a method of genome editing. And to deliver the keynote lecture on this, we have with us Dr. Debojyoti Chakraborty. He's currently a senior scientist in CSIR IGIB. And to give a brief introduction of him, I'd start with mentioning that he began his academic career from a place which is very close to our institute, which is the University of Kalyani. And he then did his master's from West Bengal University of Technology. And following that, he moved to Germany for his PhD from Max Planck and Technical University Dresden. And following a postdoc from Technical University Dresden, he is currently the senior scientist in CSIR IGIB. He is a recipient of quite a few awards, and of the very recent of few of them, it includes the INSA Young Scientist Award, the CSIR Young Scientist Award, and the Mark Young Scientist Award. He has titled the talk for today as Rewriting the Code of Life, and he proposed to share his talk with a very talented graduate student from his group, Meghali Aich. Welcome, Meghali. Thank you for being with us here. Meghali has done her BTech in genetic engineering from SRM, following which she's worked briefly on behavioral biology at JNU, and currently she's doing her PhD with Dr. Debojyoti Chakraborty and Dr. Shovik Maiti. And for her thesis work, I'm told that she is looking at pluripotency regulators in mouse embryonic stem cells. It is a great privilege to have both of you here. In the words of Dr. Chakraborty himself, he's wanted to share his talk with Meghali to ensure exposure of the actual Shiros in the lab and to enable wider participation of women scientists, which is a brilliant thing to do. And without further ado, I would invite both of you to speak on the Nobel Prize in Chemistry 2020.
Thank you, Shashnath. The last bit was very embarrassing. I almost felt like somebody very old, in the words of, when you mentioned something like that. But hello, everyone. Welcome from moderately freezing Delhi. That's why you have this here. To I hope it is not so cold in Kolkata. Um, it's a privilege to come and speak before you. I would have really loved to come to ISAR Kolkata. I've been waiting for an opportunity to come. Actually, that hasn't happened yet, but even virtually is fine. And Today, the way that we have distributed the talk, it would be, I would probably give you some kind of a brief outline about the basic work that we are doing in the lab, a little bit about Feluda, who also I noticed happens to be very close to you. So that's why you have his book right behind you in the cupboard. Learn interfere with the experience basically. And then I'll give it up to Meghali. She will talk a little bit about what CRISPR genome editing has in store, not just in terms of therapy but also understanding very very basic questions in biology. She will be talking about that, particularly in context of the work that she is doing. And yeah, and I think then we can take questions. I'll keep it relatively fast so that there is more questions that we can take later on. I think that would be an even better way of communicating than just showing the slides. So with that, can I start, or do you have anything that?
Of course, of course.
Yeah, okay. So I will try to present, and you can tell me if you can see my screen. Okay, so
We can see your screen.
can you see the slide now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So of course, the title is a little bit different, but it doesn't matter. I think the benefits of genome editing really let's say that the benefits which would matter the most are the ones that would have an immediate translational impact, if not immediate, maybe in a few years. And that's why the challenges and the way forward is something that as scientists we keep on have to discuss within ourselves, and that's where the entire field actually moves ahead, particularly for therapy. So the field of CRISPR, of course, has been recognized not late at all, because the two wonderful scientists who have received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry had published their landmark paper only in 2012. So it's one of those Nobel Prizes which has been very rapid. The other one that comes very close is probably the one on RNA interference, when Craig Mello and George Church, not George Church, Andrew Fire received the Nobel Prize, I think in 2006 or 7 probably, after their paper came out in 1998. So this has been quite rapid, and in fact, the question was really not about when CRISPR would get it, but rather who in CRISPR field would get it. And the reason is that, I deliberately put it has two heroes, which is not correct, because the CRISPR field actually has several heroes. And somebody very nicely put this up on Twitter. I couldn't I kind of shared this image every single talk now, which basically lists all the people who are in this field, who potentially have contributed to the entire field moving forward. Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier, of course, have made landmark contributions in trying to understand how a protein and an RNA complex together can be mixed to bring in specific DNA breaks. And that, of course, has far-reaching implications. But of course, that did not start off all in 1 year or in 1 day or 1 month, but it was work that was done over several decades. So this individual has not only listed the people who are involved, but actually have put right on the first row a virus, a bacteria, and archaea, who are the principal contributors to the CRISPR field. And of course, bacteria and the things that they can do, and have been quite, let's say, we have been defeated in the first phase by a virus, as is going on currently. So there's no a reason to doubt what these individuals are capable of, in what these microorganisms are capable of. And of course, the challenges that they pose also give existing solutions, and CRISPR is one of them. So it's a part of bacterial immunity that has been used for making heritable DNA changes. And a lot of people have worked on this, really a lot of people, starting from people who first figured out that there were these kind of repetitive sequences in bacteria which they had no way of identifying what these meant, and then finally sending this out to papers which were rejected in Science, Cell, and Nature, and kind of pushed the entire field back by almost 10-20 years, till somebody who picked that up and started looking at the sequences more in details, looking at the proteins that were involved, solving the crystal structures. So it's a lot of people. And the third row that you see over here also has an Indian, Prashant Mali. He's one of the main contributors in the very, very pioneering papers on CRISPR for genome editing, along with George Church. And of course, Feng Zhang, who really has taken this field forward with monumental discoveries, taking it more into the clinical domain, as well as now with the RNA editors and CRISPR diagnostics, from which Feluda has also been inspired by. So putting all that into focus, of course, field of CRISPR has several heroes, but that somebody has to be awarded a Nobel Prize, and probably the work done by Doudna and Charpentier are right in the forefront, and they are the ones who actually developed the method, showed that it works in terms of making a very precise DNA cut at a very precise location. And to bring all this knowledge together, it is only fitting that the Nobel Prize was awarded to them, because CRISPR has a lot of different applications and so on. But really, the initial pioneering work were done by this couple from University of California, Berkeley, at that point of time. So, what is CRISPR? I think there's a mixture of different people. There are PhD students, there are undergrads, and so on. So, very briefly, and Meghali will talk about this in details. Is that you can use a specific Cas protein to go and recognize a DNA sequence of interest, and this is guided by a small RNA sequence, which is shown in blue. And once it goes and binds to a DNA, double-stranded DNA, it actually breaks the DNA at a specific location. And once that break happens, the cell tries to repair that break, and in the process, it generates some kind of a repair mechanism which tries to do this repair efficiently or not efficiently. I mean, if it's efficiently, then if you can get exactly the same sequence back as it was originally. And if it's not very efficient, then there could be breaks that or insertions and deletions that can happen at that site. And this can have implications, particularly in the context of molecular biology techniques. If you want to, let's say, knock out a gene, then CRISPR can generate these kind of changes, and I think Meghali will talk about such changes in her talk. But what is very exciting as far as precision therapeutic editing is concerned is to actually bring in a small piece of DNA which has sufficient homology to the break site and integrate that into the genome. This is not a very how to say, it's not a very common thing to happen in the cell, because you have to have so many events happening together. You need to have the DNA present, you need to have the break happening, and most importantly, the repair machinery has to be happening at that precise location at that precise time of the cell cycle, which means that if all these things happen unanimously, or basically together, then you can have a new DNA which could introduce, or which can actually harbor a specific change. So if there's a disease, you can potentially change that. And that's what people have been trying to do in this field, and this is not science fiction anymore. You can literally change the DNA sequence of an individual, particularly in the context of a disease. This was an article from last year when doctors altered a person's gene, Victoria Gray, in the US, where she was suffering from sickle cell anemia. The cells were removed, and the CRISPR editing was done and returned to the same patient. And already 1 year later, this is still a little bit old news. This is from May, but we have recent reports saying that she is doing very well. The signs of the disease are gone, and of course, this is a huge field. A lot of companies have spawned to try and take this into a more realistic kind of experience, where people will potentially get cured for sickle cell anemia as a first disease, and then going on to more diseases. Sickle cell anemia is definitely not a disease of United States of America. In fact, if you see here, India is far more red than the US. And it's a disease where in India, actually, there are a lot of tribal pockets of tribal populations where people get affected. And this is a problem, because it is autosomal dominant, which means that have to have both the copies to be mutated, and there are a lot of silent carriers of the disease who have to be genetically counseled. And because of the stigma that is associated with the disease, oftentimes having such kind of a mutation in the DNA is something that people would want to not reveal. So it's a social problem. It's of course a societal problem, and it's a problem financially, because the costs for actually living with the disease are quite high. And then there is mortality and episodic pain, stroke. So it's a very deadly disease, to put in short. And CSIR had started something way back in 2017. That was just when I had started my lab here, where we were trying to figure out a way to see if CRISPR can be used to show proof of concept correction of the sickle cell mutation. It's a point mutation, mind you. So it's a point mutation which causes the glutamic acid to change into valine. So you would have to kind of revert that mutation from T to A, and hopefully you would be able to remove all the complications associated with the disease. So to cut a long story short, I won't go into details about the work we did. We actually extensively characterized an orthogonal Cas protein from different bacteria called Francisella novicida, and we found that this particular Cas has got very fundamentally different off-target sensing mechanisms by which it actually made sure that it did not bind to off targets the same way that other Cases which are currently being used in different molecular biology applications such as Streptococcus pyogenes and its high fidelity derivatives. These remain bound, so therefore it had a very distinct way of differentiating between target off target. And we could also show that if you make induced pluripotent stem cells from patients having this mutation, you can potentially correct it. And in the end, just we obviously published this, but we were trying to look for something more translatable, because most of the time such kind of studies will probably remain at the level of an academic publication, unless we really push forward to bring this in the form of a therapeutic therapeutic cure. And when that happens, or if that has to happen, you need to bring into sync a lot of different expertise, a lot of different people from different backgrounds. This is a fantastic paper that came some time back, which talks about patient customized oligonucleotide therapies for a particular disease, in which a kid was diagnosed in 2016 with this disease, and the first dosing of an antisense oligonucleotide was given in 2018. So just 2 years, during which everything right from the generating the ASOs till the toxicity studies, getting the approvals, conducting the clinical trials, everything was done. Even the preclinical studies were done. So what it told us is that if there is a definite impetus to move ahead, and the bureaucratic barriers can be successfully dealt with, then bringing such kind of innovative treatments is not absolutely impossible. I mean, if it's just the science that one has to figure that out, of course that's a lot of work one has to do, but still it gives a lot of hope for people with rare diseases. And ever since I've started working on this field, the number of letters that I have been getting from parents who really want some kind of an experimental cure, particularly for people who are suffering from, let's say, Duchenne muscular dystrophy or myogenic diseases, where the as a parent, you are just happy to add 10 more years to the life of a kid who would otherwise would only live till, let's say, 25 to 30 years. And it's very sad to see that there are potential cures that are available, but sometimes it takes way longer because of the reason that a lot of people who are really experts do not come together. And we figured that this would also be the case unless we bring in experts, and these experts would need to be at the level of developing vectors for delivery. We would also need people to generate and engineered Cas proteins, and also generate preclinical data, robust preclinical data, to say that it works well. um, so one of the things that we started immediately doing is to figure out with Andre Lieber at Seattle, whether we can actually develop vectors that we can put this Cas protein, and see if they are efficiently packaged and does an editing at the target locus or not. So this is an example of a failed experiment, okay? And this is probably something that almost everybody of us see almost 99% of the time. I particularly put this slide over there and not the one where it worked. Of course, one of the reasons I didn't put is because there is an IP related. I just took it off. But more important to show that such kind of approaches would be layered with failures. And we found that the Cas9 protein that we were using in the lab, the FN-Cas9 protein, is not performing the editing to the level that would be therapeutically relevant. So of course that would mean that we need to engineer this protein. We would need to make this into a variant that is far more efficient. And I'm happy to say that we probably are very close to getting that. In fact, we have engineered something which we are currently testing again in Seattle, to see whether this works even better. Like I said, that I removed these slides because I think this is going to be up on YouTube. So we will have some IP issues there. So this layers of failure that I talked about is also something that we faced with Feluda. And I think this has received enough coverage now, so that everybody is aware of what this technology is. It actually began with all this work that I showed you in the past about FN-Cas9 being very specific, and kind of culminated last week when somebody put up this news article which talks and compares Feluda to Soumitra Chatterjee's iconic role. Of course, he passed away, very very dear character to almost everybody of us. I mean, it's very very humbling experience to see such kind of comparisons, but it's also something that is a bit exaggerated, because like I said, that as scientists we generally make very very incremental advances, and we in this case also would like to believe that we have only made an incremental advance more than anything else. And there are a lot of people who are really working hard to bring in better and better technologies, and the sum total of all these technologies is what drives science further. But I'll tell you a little bit about how Feluda works. And of course, this work and almost everything that we have done in the past is with Dr. Shobik, who is almost intimately connected with the whole process. We share a big lab together with a lot of students, and the principle of Feluda is that we the acronym, of course, is FN-Cas9 editor linked uniform detection assay, and it works on the principle that Cas9, this particular Cas9, FN-Cas9, is highly specific in recognizing its target, and if you introduce very specific mismatches in the guide RNA, then you can direct this Cas to get evicted from its target, and this way you can principally distinguish between a target and another target which has got a point mismatch, such as, let's say, Mendelian disorders. And we can have different modes of readout for that. It could be in the form of a gel or an electrophoresis or a fluorescence readout, or in the form of a very simple lateral flow assay, which I'm going to show in the next few slides. And just before the pandemic hit, we were kind of testing all these things in the field, where you can see Dr. Shobik there in one of the on the top picture. And sickle cell anemia, like I already told you, we are very passionate about finding ways to not only cure but also obtain ways by which we can diagnose this better. And currently, there is a very crude test that is being done by the government. It's called the solubility test, where you simply look at the coagulation properties of blood. It's not accurate, and it requires further validations. And such kind of camps are very very common. So this is a camp in Chhattisgarh, in Raipur, where school children in a tertiary care center, which is basically the school, are coming in here queuing up to give their blood. And one of them, this little girl who doesn't have slippers on, is actually looking very curiously at the prospect of having her finger pricked. And I can tell you that she doesn't seem to be very thrilled about it. So we had been thinking about ways by which we can make this entire experience more enjoyable, and more importantly, to not deter people from coming in and giving their samples. So this is Rhythm, who's one of the students who is connected very very closely with the Feluda experiment. She's actually taking the saliva samples where the child is asked to spit into the tube, and the tube contains a buffer which basically lyses open the cells, and the DNA is out. It's straight from the textbooks of Maniatis, and you can then do a Feluda reaction on this within an hour. You can even make that shorter with isothermal PCR and so on. So this was where we were, trying to come out with solutions for sickle cell anemia at the beginning of the year. And of course, then COVID struck and everything changed. So we realized that we could very quickly convert all this into an assay for COVID-19, which specifically involves taking saliva samples or swabs doing something called RT-PCR, not to be confused with real time, but reverse transcription PCR, and adding biotin primers, and then combining this paper strip chemistry with the Cas9 biology to give a readout, which would then have two bands or a single band, based on which you can detect whether a sample is negative or positive. And this was work done in the lab. So there was where we tried to take a commercial strip, and we have this strip coated with antibody conjugated gold nanoparticles. And Azhar, who has since left the lab and has joined the partner who is bringing this to market, Tata Medical and Diagnostics, actually figured out what would be the right overlap between the guides, the tracer RNA and the crRNA sequences, so that this works very robustly and gives rise to a signal in the end where there would be a single line for a negative control, which is the control band, which comes up in every strip. And there would be another line, which would be the test band, which tells if the sample is positive due to the deposition of biotinylated DNA at a streptavidin line. And I'm speaking for ISA Kolkata, so I don't have to introduce Feluda without Topshe and Jotayu, because they are quintessential figures, which have to go together. So we couldn't have published a manuscript with just Feluda. It's sacrilege. So Feluda has Topshe, which is basically true outcome predicted from strip evaluation, which is a smartphone app developed with Aduvo, Bala and Gitanjali's group, and basically takes a picture, and then it has been machine language trained to give a readout. And of course, Asghar, who has developed a web tool to take inputs as a sequence for a Feluda experiment. So you can give any DNA sequence of that you want to develop a Feluda test against, not just COVID, but any SNPs or whatever it is. And then this particular app, or let's say this particular program will give you the right design for these. Won't go into details, but basically it's supposed to be at the lab level. The consumable costs are way lower, and the time is also quite low. And we can actually develop a one-pot RT-RPA Feluda reaction using isothermal PCR, where the need for the PCR machine is also gone. And I think there are a lot of people, Manoj, Ria, and now Sneha, who is working on trying to bring this, Soumya, who's trying to bring this into a second version of Feluda, let's say, which would be even more point of care. I would just maybe take 4 slides, and then I'll hand it over to Meghal, who is probably already getting impatient. So, there are certain lessons that we learned as we move from an idea to a product. I think that is probably the biggest lesson for me, since I had never seen such a kind of what it takes to go end to end from the lab, what you see in the lab, to what you get into in the form of a product. And of course, it has garnered a lot of media coverage. And recently, the ICMR and the DCGI actually approved it for use. What is very important to note here is that they actually gave it the approval to be a confirmatory test. So one who does this test does not require a QRT-PCR approval, which was quite remarkable coming for a new CRISPR test. And in fact, it's something new if you look also at the global scheme of things. And this is roughly, a kind of timeline. We looked at it in thought about making Feluda for SARS-CoV-2 in 28th of January. And of course, on September, the DCGI market release happened, and I'm told that in December, starting with Delhi, Kolkata would also get their first Feluda kits for testing. And just to give you a proof that this is not, I'm not joking about this. This was a group that we formed in January 28. That's before the first disease individual was detected in India. And that's what we see over here. I think it was Prasad's article which said that no novel coronavirus cases in India so far from the Health Ministry. And we moved on to getting this thing approved in September. And then of course this whole process has been a learning curve, not only because we needed to make the science very robust. That was at the behind it. But more importantly, along with the science, there was a lot of different things that we began to have to let's say, in some cases I would use the term fight, in some cases I would use the term to learn, and so on. One of these things is that, how do scientists and corporates speak? And corporates such as the one who actually brings the technology to market would need things which are developed in time, which are market driven, which would have a lot of scope for business, which oftentimes is needs a Google translator, to be understood at the scientific end. We thankfully have a director who happened to be the mediator in such kind of meetings, and we learned over thousands and thousands of experiments, that a lot of different things matter, ranging from all the quality of the reagents that we use, to understanding what are the problems with the current gold standard qPCR. I'm sure in IISER Kolkata also you have qPCR to be used, as used as the test, general the basic way by which you are testing SARS-CoV-2, and we also realize what are the limitations in using that. And when you compare everything with the qPCR, how that also skews the numbers drastically. Of course, the second thing that I learned is that our students are definitely our biggest asset, because they are the ones who actually work. So just like you mentioned in the beginning, Shushnato, there were a lot of people who actually stayed back during this entire pandemic period and contributed to developing Feluda, and sometimes working day and night to make sure that what works in the lab actually works in the hands of a consumer every single time. I think that is where the probably the success of this entire process comes in. So they are definitely our biggest asset. Of course, yeah, as they say, that raising a child requires a village, but if you want to bring a product to market, it actually requires the whole organization. In this case, at the level of IGIB, from the person who is waiting at the gate, which are the guards, to the director's office, everybody contributed. In fact, the people at the gates, several of them have turned COVID positive, including our students as well, due to the being there all the time, to being there, trying to make sure that everything was happening as planned, the logistics were taken care of, and so on. Feluda, on account of the name, has garnered a lot of attention on social media, and we realized this at different points. I have kind of slowly started ignoring them. In the beginning, it was very interesting to see how different types of people exist, and they launch attacks, which still happen also, I should not say, but it's also fun to see that people really take interest in science. But also at the same point of time, social media can also make science accessible to people like no one else. Somebody shared this, that Feluda was trending at position 15 after Sri Krishna and press freedom. That tells a lot about that yes, probably science is progressing to some extent. And when you have Shashi Tharoor using not a single big English word to talk about it, that also gives a kind of a different feeling altogether. And finally, pandemic is of course the mother of invention. There are inventions that are happening still in the lab, and this is just to show something that the students have actually come up with, where you do not need the PCR machine or a heating block to do a Feluda reaction, but actually can be done. I just put this here, so you can actually do this inside your hand, isothermal PCR RT-RPA reaction. We're trying to perfect it to the point that you can actually do this at home. We do not know yet if a self-testing kit would be possible within the guidelines by FDA and DCGI. But yeah, I mean, these are innovations that are continuously happening as I speak in the lab. So that tells you that pandemic also gives rise to these opportunities. And yeah, this is the acknowledgement side. A lot of different people, a lot of collaborators, and big lab, like I said. And I'm always very interested in people who would be interested in joining this work. So if you have your own ideas, if you're interested in joining, please feel free to write to me, and we are generously funded. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I'll stop sharing my screen here, and just introduce Meghali before she begins. So Meghali is, you can correct me. Meghali is probably my first student, if I am not mistaken. She joined in
Shivaksh
2000.
was first.
Sorry.
Shivaksh was first.
Shivaksh is okay. I just mixed up, but she came in 2016. Yeah, and that's even before I actually got a permanent position in IGIV. So therefore her journey and my journey has been pretty similar. She also didn't have a position. I also didn't have a position. She has it now, and she's doing excellent work. And as you would have seen in that last image. I still think, and maybe I'm again, I tend to mix up these figures, but we still have more females in the lab than males, or at least they are almost similar, and that goes a long way into saying, why the CRISPR 2020 Nobel Prize has been awarded to two fantastic female scientists, is because this is not a field which is dominated by men anymore. There are brilliant scientists, female scientists who are working, and I'm really proud of the fact that Meghali has actually worked on something which is very, very, how to say, very, very isolated from the rest of the work that goes on in the lab, which is in the field of embryonic stem cell biology, as the rest of the lab has been working very, very hard on CRISPR technologies and so on. She has been taking inputs from everybody and developing her own project in a way such that she uses CRISPR almost on a daily basis now. So she has done very remarkable work, and we would be kind of communicating this hopefully sometime soon. It doesn't work as in publication field as simple as that, but we will be hopefully communicating that, and I wish her all the best. So over to you, Meghali.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, IFER Kolkata, for having me here today. And thank you, sir, for your encouraging words. It's really a big opportunity for me as well to be present here today and represent the work of our lab in this forum. Specifically, I'll be talking about my work and how we have used CRISPR in the stem cell biology. And I shall also give a brief introduction about stem cell biology and about the work that I have been doing for a couple of years. So I'll start my work. Please let me know if my screen is visible. Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay. So, as Dr. Devojyoti has spoken about CRISPR and about the lab-developed technique Feluda at length, so I would not talk much about CRISPR right now, and I would be focusing more on stem cell and the application of CRISPR in a stem cell model. So to start with, as we know that the CRISPR-Cas9 genetic tool works in two main pathways. First is the one is the non-homologous end joining, and the other is the homologous directed repair. In the mostly the NHEJ pathway is used for the disruption of gene of interest, as it can incorporate indels, and the homologous directed repair is mostly used for the correction of gene, where you use a donor template and you integrate the donor template in the faulty gene. So it is mostly used for the correction of genes. And CRISPR-Cas9 does not only do the gene editing, it has many other applications as well. So people all over the world have been working on CRISPR and developing different tools. They have been making dead forms of the Cas protein, and they have been fusing it with different epigenetic modulators and epigenetic repressors and transcriptional activators, and then they have been using it. So here I'll be putting up some examples. So you can use CRISPR-Cas9 in for transcriptional repression and activation. So the method is called the CRISPR-I and CRISPR-A. So CRISPR-I is basically, it's a dead form of Cas9 where you fuse it with the CRAB, which is known to be a universal repressor, and you target the promoter regions, and that recruits different it recruits different repressor molecules, and thus the transcription of the gene is inactivated. Similarly, CRISPR-A, which is CRISPR activator, you can fuse a VP16, which is known as the universal activator, and activate your gene of interest. Similarly, CRISPR-Cas9 system can also be used for epigenetic modifications, where you can fuse different epigenetic modifiers like DNMT or HDAC for acetylation or demethylation or methylation, and thus you can regulate your gene of interest. Cas9, CRISPR-Cas9 has also been used widely for live and dead cell imaging, where you can fuse fluorescent molecules like GFP, RFP with your dead Cas9, or you can also label your guide RNAs with molecules like Cy5, Cy3, and do a live cell or dead cell imaging. And CRISPR libraries are also being used widely for screening purposes, where you do genome-wide targeting or random mutations, and then screen out your particular phenotypes based on that. So, as we know, when we approach a particular question, we generally have we generally follow either the reverse genetic method or the forward genetic method. For reverse genetic method is generally the one where we already know about a gene, and we modulate it and try to find out the phenotype that it forms after modulating that gene, which is also been done by different chemical methods. And CRISPR is also known to CRISPR in today's research world. CRISPR is used widely for that. Even in the forward genetics method, where you already know a phenotype, or you make random mutations and develop a particular phenotype and try to find the causal gene. So this can also be done by CRISPR libraries. So in my work, I will be explaining about how we have used the reverse genetic method to understand a particular gene of interest in the stem cell biology. Now, to go ahead, I would briefly introduce you to what stem cell is. Basically, there are two major types of stem cells. First is the embryonic stem cells and the adult stem cells. So here is a beautiful map that explains your entire developmental process from the oocyte to the embryo. So embryonic stem cells are derived from the inner cell mass of the developing blastocyst, and embryonic stem cells possess a very important properties which are very special, and it is different from other cell types, is that it can give rise to cells of its own, which is called the self-renewal process, and also it has the capacity to differentiate into any cell type or cells of any lineage, which is called the pluripotent. So a developing blastocyst, the inner cell mass basically are the cells that have the capacity to form cells of any lineage, and hence they are pluripotent in nature. And these embryonic stem cells can give rise to three different lineages, which is the ectoderm, mesoderm, and endodermal in nature, which are multipotent, and then they further differentiate to forms terminally differentiated cells. Now, as the cells divide and differentiate from the undifferentiated condition to the differentiated condition, the potency of the cells keeps reducing, and when the cells become fully differentiated, they cannot go into any other cell types anymore. So this is an example of the embryonic stem cells, and adult stem cells can be derived from different organs of the body, like brains have the neuronal stem cells, heart, bone marrow, liver, kidney. They have different adult stem cells, which are basically multipotent in nature but not pluripotent, multipotent or unipotent generally. Now to go ahead, we are not just limited by embryonic stem cells or adult stem cells. In 2006, Professor Yamanaka of Kyoto University has developed this process called reprogramming, where you can introduce the major key pluripotency markers, which are OCT4, SOX2, KLF4, and NANOTH, in the somatic cells, which can be derived from a human, like any human, adult human, and you can introduce these factors, which are also called the Yamanaka factors, and reprogram the cells to behave as embryonic stem cells, and these specialized cells are called induced pluripotent stem cells. So they have the same property as the similar property as that of embryonic stem cells, and they can undergo in vitro differentiation to give rise to different cells of different lineages. And for the past couple of years, iPSCs and ESCs have been widely studied for different purposes like drug screening, regenerative medicine, genomic and metabolomic studies, disease modeling, gene therapy, diagnostics, and also studying different stem cell biology properties. So to go ahead with the work that I have been doing, I think I should give a brief introduction about how the stem cell biology works. So as the stem cells or the pluripotent cells, while they differentiate, there's a plethora of processes or the factors that undergo changes. So like we know that the embryonic stem cells or the undifferentiated cells have a very high level of glycolysis, which gets reduced as the cell starts differentiating. Similarly, the mitochondrial fissions are very dynamic in a stem cell condition, but which are not as much in a specialized cell or in a differentiated cells. Similarly, there are the whole stem cell pluripotency gene regulatory network is a huge network. It consists of various factors and various epigenetic modifiers and regulators, cofactors that modulate the activation and inactivation of various genes. So generally in an undifferentiated condition, the chromatin state is generally very open, very flexible, and the pluripotency and self-renewal gene are almost always constitutively expressed, while the genes that are responsible for developmental processes or differentiation are kept silent. And these factors are very important, and also these factors auto-regulate themselves, and they also undergo processes like splicing or post-translational modifications in a undifferentiated cells, so that they behave in a specialized way. So as I have mentioned, that alternative splicing is also a very important mechanism in a stem cell biology, which is important for undifferentiated cells to maintain their stemness. So I'll just quickly tell how the splicing mechanism works. We know that the constitutive splicing, here the introns get removed and the exons get stitched, but there are different other events in the alternative splicing, such as exon skipping, intron retention, alternative 5' and 3' splice site integration, where the in 5' splice site, this part of the 5' site of the exon get incorporated in one isoform while not in the other isoforms. I'll show you a very nice example of this type of lineage specific isoform transcripts that are generated in stem cells. So this particular gene, this particular protein, FOXP1, undergoes this exon skipping method, where basically it is a mutually exclusive event, where when the red exon gets introduced, it forms an isoform which is specific for stem cell lineage, but if the blue isoforms get incorporated, it forms isoform which is specific for the differentiated cells. So this is how the various factors undergo alternative splicing, and they regulate the ESL biology. Similarly, from the past couple of years, a lot of non-coding RNAs have been studied widely, which may have positive or negative role in maintaining the stem cell identity. One amongst them is very nicely reported, which is LNCRNA PANCT1, which was found to be positively regulating the stem cell identity. On further investigation, it was found that PANCT1, LNCRNA PANCT1, interacts with a novel uncharacterized protein, which it apparently physically interacts with this protein and recruits this protein into the genomic sites in a very specific cell cycle manner. And on further investigation, they had found that this interaction and the binding at the genomic sites happens at at the G1 phase, which was also very nicely shown by the RIP experiment in a synchronized and unsynchronized condition. The same group had further studied the TOF1 this uncharacterized, sorry, I did not mention it. So this uncharacterized protein, hereby I'll be mentioning as TOF1. So this protein TOF1 they further wanted to understand how this TOF1 works like, or if it binds in the genomic, since it goes inside the nucleus, does it bind to the genomic loci, and what all loci does it bind? So they did a chromatin immunoprecipitation, and they find that on doing a ChIP-seq analysis, they find that TOF1 binds to a canonical OCT-SOX motif in the promoter regions of various pluripotency markers, and this the peaks of TOF1 ChIP-seq data also overlapped or with the previously reported OCT4 ChIP-seq data. So it was quite evident that TOF1 binds to the OCT-SOX motif as like OCT4. Therefore, it might be one of the uncharacterized pluripotency regulator. But when they wanted to know if it has a, it works as a transcriptional factor or how it works, like they on understanding the structural of this protein, it was found that it does not bind to the DNA, and also the peaks of the TOF1 ChIP-seq data were not as strong as that of OCT4. So it was sure that it is not a bona fide transcription factor, but it is playing some role in the ESL identity, ESL maintenance and identity. And also when they did a RNA-I of the TOF1 protein, they see that the alkaline phosphatase staining showed that the stem cells undergo differentiation on doing an RNAi. So it was established that this protein TOF1 manifests the characteristics of a bona fide pluripotency regulator. Now, keeping all this information in mind, we wanted to study how this TOF1 works like, and further wanted to characterize this protein. So to go ahead with the experiments, we had to first validate the previous information, and we first tried to perturb this particular protein in the ES cells, and we designed the experimental model. So we designed these experiments by overexpressing this protein by cloning the CDS region under a strong promoter, and we tried to see if when we overexpress this protein, do we see any change in the other pluripotency markers or not? And here I'm showing you this data where we see that on overexpressing TOF1, other pluripotency markers also get upregulated, which was quite a hunch for us that it might play some role in maintaining the stem cell identity. Now we wanted to perturb it by downregulating or knocking out this protein in the ES cells. So for downregulation, we had used the CRISPR-I method, where we had designed guide RNAs targeting at promoter regions of this gene, and using a dead form of Cas9. So here in this, for this application, we had used the FNCas9 protein, which was used in the Feluda experiment also. So that protein, that Cas9 protein we have used, which is dead form, so it does not cut. Its enzymatic catalytic domain is mutated, so it does not cut. So it is a dead form which is fused with a crab, as I had showed earlier, that it acts as a repressor molecule. So we had used this, and for the knockout, we had designed guide RNAs at the axonal regions, and we had cloned them in a vector where we can clone 2 guide RNAs along with the Cas9 protein. So here we had found that when I had downregulated the TOF1 protein, we could see that the other pluripotency markers also get downregulated quite significantly. And while doing a knockout, which was done on the gene body, we had used the active Cas9, and using the guide RNAs for knocking out, we had also seen that the other pluripotency markers also get downregulated, as well as it was confirmed with the Western blot. So I had also tried to do a rescue experiment where in a TOF1 knockout background, I had tried to overexpress the TOF1 protein, and I could see that there is partial increase in the TOF1 expression, which was also found for the other factors. Now, all these experiments gave us an idea that TOF1 somehow regulates the stem cell identity. It regulates the stem cell associated factors, but we did not know how the regulation is happening, or it was important for us to understand if this is happening directly or indirectly. So we wanted to check if TOF1 is associated with other markers or not. So we checked into the mass spec data of this TOF1 protein, and we see that TOF1 interacts with a lot of protein which have a role in mRNA processing or splicing, or are key splicing factors in the embryonic stem cell conditions. So all these proteins that I have marked in red circles are well-known splicing factors or mRNA processing enzymes in stem cells. Now it was important for us to understand that if TOF1 interacts with this protein, does TOF1 also belong to this pathway, or is TOF1 also a splicing factor? So it was necessary for us to understand where the TOF1 localizes, because it is well studied that the splicing factors or the spliceosome mechanism, the proteins involved in spliceosome and mRNA processing enzymes generally localize at the nuclear speckles, and hence you would appreciate to see that we had seen a very nice co-localization of this TOF1 protein with the nuclear speckle marker SC35. After this, we were quite sure that TOF1 is one of the splicing factor that is regulating the TOF1's individual uh, transcription, as well as it is somewhere associated with some other proteins or the splicing factors to regulate the key pluripotency markers as well. But this hypothesis of us also got strengthened when we did a RNA sequencing of our TOF1 overexpressed samples, and we see that in the TOF1 overexpressed samples there is a splicing event happening. So there is exon skipping that is happening in the TOF1 overexpressed samples. So we could finally come to a conclusion or have a slight hunch that probably TOF1 is one of the splicing factors that is playing some role in the maintenance of the stem cell identity by interacting with this LNC RNA PANCT1 and goes inside the nuclear speckles and processes the transcripts which are associated with stem cells, but we can be fully sure once we do it in a knockout background. So to summarize our study, so far whatever we have found, that modulating TOF1 regulates the key pluripotency markers that indicates that TOF1 is a bona fide regulator of the embryonic stem cells. And RNA-seq analysis of the CRISPR-mediated knockout cells will also reveal us a differently alternatively spliced transcript which will be necessary for maintaining the ESL's identity. And it is also necessary to investigate if TOF1 has the potential to function as a reprogramming factor or not, because there are a lot of factors which act as a pluripotency regulator but may not be a reprogramming factor. So I think it is very important for us to understand if TOF1 has a role as a reprogramming factor or not. So I think we would be able to let you know once we do all these experiments. So as I end this talk, I would take the opportunity to mention two eminent scientists who have been awarded the Nobel Prize in 2012 for their immense contribution in the stem cell biology and in the field of stem cell biology, and who have worked profoundly for developing the iPSCs and the somatic nuclear transfer techniques. And I would quote Sir John Gurdon, that it is a very complex network of genes making products which go into the nucleus and turns on other genes. And in fact, you find a continuing network of processes going on in a very complex way by which genes are subject to this continual adjustment. As you might say, the computer reprogrammer deciding which genes ultimately work. And uh, and I have to mention the current Nobel Prize winners, so Dr. Emmanuel Charpentier and Dr. Jennifer Doudna, and I'll quote Dr. Jennifer Doudna that CRISPR is a wonderful tool that allows one to ask and answer questions that were impossible to address previously and will help solve problems for humanity. So today we are using CRISPR as a gene editing tool on studying various manipulations on genes in the stem cells and trying to figure out various disease models and different other processes as a gene therapy as well. And as Sir Gordon says, like the computer programmers, I hope we become the genetic programmer and continue, rewriting the code of life and serve the humanity as much as we can. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Meghali. Thank you, Dr. Chakraborty. It was a humbling experience to get to know, get a glimpse of all the work going on in your lab, which includes sickle cell anemia, COVID, top1, pluripotent stem cells. And before we go on to the question answer round, I will like to put it on record that this event is being brought to you by Cogito 137, which is the science communication platform of IISER Kolkata, and the Science Club of IISER Kolkata as a collaborative event. And for the question answer round, I have with me Dr. Dhiman Pal, who is also an alumni of IISER Kolkata and who is currently in Johns Hopkins University in US. Dhimanda, would you like to briefly introduce about what you work on? And
yeah, so I was in IISER in the same department as Shushnato is currently. I did my PhD with Dr. Rupak Dotto, and I basically come from a background of molecular parasitology. I worked on Leishmania. I mean, it's a parasite that's quite prevalent in the country. Then I decided to change my field a little bit, and I moved over to cell migration, and so that's what I work on. I work on cell migration in these amoeba called Dictyostelium, and that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years now. So yes, and thank you Shushnato and Cogito for inviting me for this. It was really brilliant talks from both of you. Thank you very much. Hopefully we can have a fruitful discussion.
yes, it's good to have all of you here, and I think we all appreciate that we work on varied topics, but we have had to use CRISPR as a tool for our works, and the tool is such magnificent and so powerful that a lot of fields in biology are using them currently. But like Dr. Chakraborty said, that the Feluda COVID testing kit is getting a lot of attention. I believe it's getting a lot of attention that it deserves. And let's talk about that first. And I'd like to start by asking that what came first? Like what came first, the egg or the chicken? I'd like to know what came first, the name or the acronym. FN-Cas9 editor linked uniform detection assay or Feluda?
So yeah, I mean, this seems to be the most common question I'm getting in different forums. Well, so I think there was a question in the chat box. I saw somebody put that, whether there are other tests similar to Feluda. There are actually. So there are several CRISPR-based tests which are currently being at different stages of development. At least 2 of them have got FDA EUA, both using Cas13 and Cas12 systems. And when these tests came out, immediately the naming spree started, first with Sherlock, and then Detector, and then Holmes. And when we were developing this, we were also imagining that if we had to bring a name, we had to think about an Indian detective's name. And me and my wife, we were sitting and discussing this, what could be the name. And I was thinking more Bomkesh, really. And then we realized that that's a very heavy name. and it's difficult to bring all those acronyms together. And since we had F and F, FN-Cas9 was always there, so it took 5 minutes to come up with that. Topshe and Jatayu were much more simpler because they just simply evolved. We could come up with that later on. Well, the naming is really interesting because we have had episodes where from the highest offices in the country we have been asked to think about names, alternate names, etc., etc. But the naming does matter in this case, I would say. Yeah.
Of course it does. Even if it was Bomkesh or be it Feluda, means they are both thinking individuals who act first. And from your slides, I got to know that you started to conceptualize this idea back in January 28, and you had a working prototype by the first week of March, even when we did not go into the lockdown in our country. So I would like all of us to appreciate that you have worked really fast on this. Like, that needs to be appreciated. And I'd like to clarify one thing. You said that you believe that IISER Kolkata is also doing QRT-PCR based tests on campus, but I'm sorry to say that IISER Kolkata is doing no tests at all.
Oh, okay. That's but there is some kind of a testing regimen. No, is it not mandatory?
The testing facilities in IISER is a problem right now. There are not enough tests, and there was some collaboration with JNM. Like IISER has donated its QRT, the real-time PCR machine, to JNM Hospital Kalyani, who are doing the tests there, and that's how it's being done right now.
Okay.
And so I'll request the audience that if you are comfortable with coming on camera or switching on your mic and asking the questions, you can ask your questions, or you can even drop in your questions in the chat. And Himanda has already asked a few questions in the chat. If you can ask them again, maybe.
Yeah, I can quickly check here. So you said about how successful are the current treatment and disease management approaches. It's relatively successful. It's an old disease. Like sickle cell anemia has been there since ever, and hydroxyurea is the most prevalent drug which is being used. It has got an FDA approval, but not, I think, still waiting approval in India. But it is being given at different places by clinicians, and it does pretty well to stop sickling. But it is works with some patients. Doesn't work with some. So there is a lot of genetic predisposition why it responds in that way. So definitely, it's there are better ways by which one can think of doing things. I think I already mentioned about other CRISPR diagnostic tests. Most of these work on the principle of collateral cleavage, Cas12, Cas13 based systems. There are many now, actually. I mean, there's some CRISPR test coming every month almost, but principally relying on this. Diptomit has asked Meghalidi. Meghalidi can reply.
I'll read out the question that Diptomit has asked, that how will you determine whether TOF1 can act as a reprogramming factor or not? Like, I would like to know what kind of experiments are required to determine whether a molecule can act as a reprogramming factor.
Yeah, hi Diptamit. Yeah, so as I had shown you in the previous slide, that nowadays the reprogramming event is done widely in somatic cells, where you introduce this Sendai virus based so people use both Sendai virus and plasmid based introduction of the OSKM factors. So we already have this Sendai virus based kits in our lab. So I am planning to make a stable cell line of a TOF1 in a fibroblast cell, which is a terminally differentiated cells, and I plan to introduce this OSKM factor in different combinations, it's like TOF1 with OCT4 or SOX2, or in different manners, and would like to see if when I introduce these factors and when TOF1 is present, does it also help, or does it facilitate the reprogramming process, or just the introduction of TOF1 helps? Like, we do not know. We have to try that out.
There's
I hope
another.
that helps. Diptomit, there's one more question from Biplab Shaha, who is asking, what is the role of streptavidin protein in Feluda test, and why have you chosen only this protein?
It's purely to make it how to say to make it work with the commercial strips. It's not necessary to have streptavidin, but the commercial strip actually has a streptavidin line, and because there's not much time here to do the engineering and chemistry ourselves, so we went ahead with what is already there. So our biotin is there in our DNA fragments, and this interacts with the streptavidin and causes accumulation of nanoparticles, giving rise to the signal. So that's how the current chemistry works. But of course, there is no hard and fast rule to say that that has to be the only way to do it.
Okay, since there are no more questions at this moment, I'll ask a question myself. Uh, you started with saying that CRISPR, the Nobel Prize has been awarded to two scientists this year, but it's not just them who has contributed to the field, and it starts, I think, back in 80s or so when it was first identified in E. coli. The repeat sequencer identified in E. coli, and I would like to know that how important it is to appreciate the basic science and how does that eventually translate into something so varied like CRISPR is being used. We got a glimpse of all the work going on in your lab. We know that you mentioned George Church in your slide. George Church, we know that is working to try to resurrect the woolly mammoth using CRISPR and editing the elephant genome into a mammoth genome. And even we have heard about CRISPR babies in China, where there's a lot of controversy around them. I'd like you to comment on the basic science translating to all of this.
So I think it's now it's being almost it's common knowledge that these things are all kinds of discoveries have their foundations in very strong basic science. There's no doubt about this, and it has been underscored in different platforms. What is also important is to have kind of a focused basic science. I mean, it could be because curiosity has no bounds, so you can actually approach different ways, different questions, but also to bring in some focus is oftentimes necessary. And any kind of focus has to be coming with good practices of trying to figure out what are those questions that require to be addressed, what need to be addressed, and that should drive the basic science question. That is what I believe. What is also important to understand is that this is very important in an Indian perspective, because most of the time we are playing catching up. So we have technologies that we try to inculcate from abroad. We try to kind of replicate over here way after the technology has already been there all the time, and it has got translated into therapies and products. This is unfortunately not very good if you look at the long-term prospects of science, because the fact that CRISPR came into being was probably because scientists were not only funded but also encouraged to address questions that were ambitious, that did not have kind of a let's say a concrete 2-year, 3-year, 4-year review plan like most of our projects are based on. So it's very important to probably encourage these kind of questions, some questions which will probably not lead to anything, but if it means that if it means that one has to address questions that nobody has done in the past, and there is a solid work plan and there is competence, then it can lead to very, very exciting things. CRISPR is just an example of that. So if you look at how the CRISPR field has progressed, it's tremendous. I mean, of course, the Cas protein and these elements of CRISPR were discovered way back, but the applications into fields such as what, let's say, you mentioned George Church is a favorite for so many reasons, to things such as bringing the woolly mammoth. It sounds very, very cool and exciting, but there are a lot of implications for basic biology in this entire project that he's running, which goes all the way from inserting multiple genetic components into a single genome, to the fact that what are the ethics surrounding these kind of experiments. So he is probably addressing a lot of these things with his approaches, but not everybody is George Church, of course, and not everybody would have have the kind of support and an environment that he has. But it tells a little bit about what ambitious projects can do. I mean, for example, he has encoded a movie into DNA using CRISPR. On a short-term basis, it probably doesn't mean much. But if you think of a situation when data would be there would be so much of data that is generated, and there is so little space to store it. Bacteria, which is doubling at the rate of minutes, would probably the best library that you can put data into, right? So these are the type of things that probably one needs to think about, thinking out of the box, and make sure that the core basic science research is not only encouraged but also funded and promoted.
Very true. Like also, these are the kind of things that gets non-technical people excited towards science, I would say, to some extent.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
maybe.
you need the marketing. You need the marketing, like the woolly mammoth or a very catchy name like Feluda to get people interested for the funding. And I mean, it helps. Definitely helps.
That's true. That's true.
You did mention about the ethical concerns around genome editing, and I would ask you to comment on it more in terms of genome editing for humans. Like, we all agree that rare genetic diseases, curing them would help mankind, but like, does it have some negative connotations to it as well?
So I think Meghali can pitch in. What are the problems with the human genome editing? What are the current problems, and then maybe I can also.
So, when using CRISPR as a editing tool for mostly in a diagnostic purpose, I believe that first that we need to keep in mind is CRISPR may be a very precise tool, also has a lot of off-target effects, which might lead to complications of other diseases as well. Like, we may or may not form other diseases, but we should keep that in mind. And when it brings to the therapeutic purpose or introduction of CRISPR inside the human body, first, the introduction is also a complicated process, and I think more than the delivery process, I think we need to keep in mind that we really use a very precise tool for that it does not lead to any other complications. Do you want to add anything?
Right. So, and I think also the fact that genome editing can happen in both ways. It can happen in somatic cells, also in germline cells. I think generally the problem is with germline cells. Somatic cells, probably people are they have gotten used to the fact that it is something that remains in the individual in which you are editing, and therefore, if you can correct a disease, why not? The problem generally happens when you do this in the embryo, because then a lot of things are kind of unanswered. One, of course, is the safety. Two, what is the long-term follow-up of such a change? We have no way to know unless the baby develops, grows into an individual. But thirdly, very importantly, if it is done for a synthetic purpose, then what is the ethical? So what are the ethical questions about whether such an individual has been consulted before his or her genetic material has been edited? So that is also going into a domain of more individual liberties and freedom, which more and more we will probably go from. I would even term it as genetic liberty. Since we are going into an age of genome editing at the level of an individual.
Okay.
I think there's a
There's
question.
one.
Question in the chat. So, how is CRISPR-Cas9 being used for finding a treatment for SCID? Could you explain the bubble boy therapy?
Not an expert in that for the SCID diseases, but as far as I know, there are some adenovector trials that have again started for SCID. SCID is one of those diseases which was unfortunately pushed the entire field of gene therapy by almost 10-15 years after the death had happened, due to immunological responses upon receiving the treatment. But I would probably not comment here because I'm not very well versed with the technicalities of the disease and how they are doing it.
Okay, so Himanda, if you have any more questions in mind.
I had a technical question regarding Feluda. I mean, how does it compare as far as accuracy or sensitivity with the current? I mean, the mainstay market tests like the RT-PCR or the antigen tests that are available.
Yeah, so I mean, this has now been teased back and forth in multiple levels. So I can tell you the figures from the DCGI in their tests was something close to 96% sensitivity and 98% specificity. This was when they did the evaluations. In our hands, we go anywhere between 97 to 100% sensitivity on good days, because always one has to remember these values are relative. Sensitivity and specificity are simply numbers which you tend to use some kind of a relative measurement. In this case, it is the quantitative real-time PCR test. And when the market is flooded with the different types of quantitative real-time PCR kits with varying sensitivities, the actual value of a new test in terms of sensitivity specificity is very difficult to determine accurately. So I would rather say a range is much better than putting a number. So in general, anything which is around 95% by FDA guidelines is as good as a perfect test. And like I said, even in our hands, QRT-PCR tests do not seem to be gold anymore. So if you sequence them, some of the negative samples turn out to be positive if you do a genome sequencing or a viral RNA sequencing. So round about greater than 95% is what I would say. Antigen tests, of course, are not, because the very basic premise of an antigen test is that it is trying to detect proteins, and when you try to detect proteins, your sensitivity of your device totally determines how many proteins you can capture, since there is no amplification happening. So anywhere between 50% to 70% sensitivity is what the current antigen tests are giving in the sero surveys.
Okay, thank you.
Because we are talking about testing, I would like to know about your opinions on the testing facilities that we have in our country, and do you think that are we doing enough to combat this pandemic?
If we did enough, then we would have probably better numbers. I know there is a group of people who probably are anti-testers in what they think and feel, and they try to put rationalized arguments about why we do not need testing and so on. I don't think so. This is very, very scientifically justified, since the numbers prove otherwise. Purely from the point of view that the number of the number of spreaders that you can detect, isolate, and quarantine would also reflect on the total number of cases in a population. So therefore, testing definitely has to be ramped up. Question is that how do you get tested if you are asymptomatic? Because you generally do not then get tested, whereas a large number of patients seems to be asymptomatic. We see it on a regular basis here. So this means that we probably would need we probably need to know how to make this even more commonplace. The testing becomes more commonplace. Yeah, I mean, RT-PCR is, of course, has long turnaround times. Feluda in its present format requires a lab to do. We are really working hard to make sure that we can have something which is even closer to home. And I think that is probably the way. And I mean, it's not just from us, but a lot of people are working on developing solutions which can be done more at a kind of a home. I think Meghali can comment something on how it is happening in IGIV. Just a kind of a very broad overview, not a very detailed.
Yeah, so here in IGIB, almost every week on Mondays, so there is a team from Dr. Sridhar's lab who does this RT-PCR based testing. So people who stay inside the campus in the hostel, we are advised to take tests almost whenever it is possible. So, and everybody, like all the staffs and everybody are allowed to get their tests done. So it happens almost every week, more or less. And then
That is
we have
really
of course, it's all voluntary, and it's all part
voluntary.
of the scientific thing. Because IGIB is also doing large number of sequencing experiments and so on. So it's an academic exercise. But I think it's a good exercise, and we also have sero surveys that are being done regularly as well to make sure how, as a community, the institute is developing a kind of response to the virus.
As a
Serotests
student
are
of
also
science, I would say that is the way to tackle the situation, and I am a bit worried about how ISA Kolkata is dealing with it. Uh, anyway, like I think we do agree that the asymptomatic people do need to be tested, which is not at all being done in our country right now. So, do you think that the Feluda test kit, after once we have enough of them in the market, testing of asymptomatic people would be considered by the government?
I think it totally depends on the so the one of the things that we hope. I mean, of course, we do not make the kits. The kit is manufactured by Tata Medical
Yeah, yeah.
Diagnostics. And they are the ones who will distribute it. They'll find a way to do the testing. We hope that the timing would be shortened, because currently the reason why testing is not happening enough is because there are long turnaround times. There are queues for submitting a sample and getting a report, which often has to do with the number of pooling that qPCR requires, as well as the fact that the general qPCR regimen is longer. So Feluda should be able to bring that down, is what my hope is. But like I said, that it would require even more innovations, and I won't go into details of that, but there are people in the lab who are working very hard to try to bring this more point of care, so that you can possibly do a Feluda version 1.2, 1.5, or whatever it is, at your local doctor's office, or let's say even at home at some point. So that's where I think we really need to take this to, in order to make sure that more and more people can test.
So, if I have understood it right, that right now there's the need of a normal PCR, not a RT-PCR, a normal
Yes, but of course, because normal
PCR.
PCRs are there in labs. I mean, of course, ICER is some place where one can potentially do it, but the current kits would not be, as far as I understand, will probably be, the testing will be done in collaboration with hospitals and the
Diagnostic centers
diagnostic
and all.
centers, basically, like the path labs and so on. So they will not be probably distributed to individuals. But let's see what happens in the future. I mean, we are also trying to develop ways by which, in a pandemic situation, everything has to be ramped up. Even a production of kits has to be ramped up at tremendous pace to cater to the demands. And currently, the demands are not just from India, but from a large number of countries. So I think those are the things that has to be, they are trying to figure out. Yeah.
I am sure you have done your part in helping the cause. And there's one more question
Yeah.
from the audience, which is Pavitra, and he's asking, can you comment on implications and effectiveness of these tools in treatment of neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, especially the ones for which the exact cause is still unknown?
Meghali should take this. Yeah.
Okay, hi Pavitra. I think so. The question is very legit, and a lot of scientists are definitely working on it. What I believe is because diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are like they consist of a lot of genes which are involved in this particular disease, and also it's not so it's a spectra of different genes which participate, and defects in a lot of genes which accumulates together to form a particular disease. So I think targeting each one of them individually and then studying it might take a little time, and I think people are working on making a disease model, and people are also developing brain organoids. They are recapitulating that mutations in the stem cells or iPSCs, and then they are developing organoids, brain organoids, and trying to study the developmental process. And since Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are very late onset diseases, so it happens in a very old age, so to recapitulate them in a organoid model is also a little difficult, because generally to reach up to that stage, you need to keep growing and keep maintaining the organoids. So I think people are of course working, and hopefully we'll get an answer soon to it.
Thank you. I had a question regarding the commercialization of the Feluda kit. So, if I understood it correctly, it's currently being developed by Tata now for selling out for commercial purposes. So, what is I mean, currently in the present situation that we have, I mean, what is the strategy? I mean, since you would probably need a lot of kits at a very short amount of time rather. I mean, what areas or which sections of are you planning to target first, or how is it? What sort of a strategy are you guys taking? Or
So to be very honest, I probably don't have an answer to that question because it's a business decision by the company, and we are not part of that. We as inventors, we have licensed it, and it's a non-exclusive license, which means that anybody, for that matter, can come and take this up. Tata, of course, is the first one who has come and brought this, got it cleared. So I think they have revealed a few of their business plans in their press releases, which from what is up there, they are bringing this first in Delhi on first week of December. That's 1st of December, I think, in collaboration with Apollo Hospitals. And then I think they're rolling it out in 10 cities, Kolkata included, within the next week or 2 weeks or so, and then from there phased out into other cities of India. So they have a plan of ramping the production up to I think 1 million maybe, but these numbers is something that I am as much getting this information from the press more than anyone else, so I don't have the real information.
Because you said it's a non-exclusive license, so ideally anyone can come and start
Yeah,
producing
yeah,
this, and
that's
that would
true.
always help. So I would like you to comment on how should one go about it if they're at all interested to do so.
So the process is it's a very streamlined process in CSIR, where if you have a technology and you put it up for an EOI, expression of interest, then any interested party can contact us through there is a business development group, BDMG, in a CSIR institute, and then the BDMG basically invites them to sign a non-disclosure agreement, after which the technical details are shared. And then if they're interested, then a technology transfer document is prepared with whatever details in that. And then you can work out how that TTD will finally be in terms of how the product will be validated, etc., etc. It's a very, very streamlined process of how such kind of things happen, at least in the CSR mode. Yeah.
Okay, I think that would be a lot of help to a lot of people once it goes up on our YouTube channel. If there are no more questions, I think we can call it a day. We have already crossed our 1.5 hours time limit that we had set for ourselves. It was wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
And like you intended to visit ISA Kolkata someday, I also hope that that does happen sometime soon. Maybe we'll meet sometime on our
Yes, we will,
campus.
and I'll make sure to bring a Feluda kit along, and then we can have a. Yeah. So
Okay,
thanks again for the nice, for the program and for inviting both of us. Yeah.
you are most welcome. I should thank Cogito 137 and Science Club of ISA Kolkata for organizing this, and I would request the organizers or speakers and organizers to kindly stay back while the rest of the audience can leave, so that we can take a group picture together.
So should we stay back or?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Yes. Can you switch on your cameras, guys?
don't be shy.
Shreyas. Anyway, I'll take a picture.
COVID times, and this is how pictures are taken now.
Anyway, thank you for all your time. Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you
Thank you,
for
everyone.
having us.
Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, good night.
Bye.
Gudun?
Bolo. No, right.
Teacher.
Someone stop the recording. Okay, we're done here.